continent of the world. Russia's war in Ukraine, refugees fleeing Afghanistan, and the fighting in Sudan have pushed the total number of refugees forced to seek shelter abroad and those displaced within their own countries to an unprecedented level, said UNHCR and UN Refugee Agency. At the end of last year, 108.4 million people were displaced, UNHCR said in its flagship annual report, Global Trends in Forced Displacement. The number was up 19.1 million from the end of 2021, the biggest ever increase since the records began back in 1975. Since then, the eruption of the conflict in Sudan has triggered further displacement, pushing the global total to an estimated 110 million by May. Of the 2023-22 global total, 35.3 million were refugees who fled abroad, with 62.5 million being internally displaced. There were 5.4 million asylum seekers and a further 5.2 million other people, predominantly from Venezuela, needing international protection. The UN High Commissioner for Refugees noted that around 76% of refugees fled to low and middle-income countries, while 70% stayed in neighboring countries. He said the US case was more complex, but added, "We are worried about denial of access to asylum in the United States." Some 4,000 and 67,000 people have fled Sudan since fighting between warring parties broke out in mid-April, while more than 1.4 million have become internally displaced.
Say, this is where we stand today. We have 110 million people that have fled because of conflict, persecution, discrimination, violence, often mixed with other motives, in particular, the impact of climate change. Increase, you may recall just a couple of years ago, or maybe last year, when we announced that for the first time we had gone over 100 million displaced people. Well, already 10% more have been added to this figure. It's quite an indictment on the state of our world, if I may say, to have to report that. It's prevail. The considerations made by governments are security-based. We have to think about our security. We have a duty to our people. These big flows threaten that. True, it's true, but it's also true sometimes, but it cannot be the only consideration. And this is what we hear, our public opinion is tired, we cannot take more people. Well, leadership is about convincing your public opinion that there are people that deserve international protection, and therefore everything needs to be done.
Now, the world's first international treaty to protect the high seas is scheduled to be adopted on Monday at the United Nations, a huge step for the historic environmental accord for more than 15 years of discussions. The treaty, among other things, establishes principles for sharing the benefits of marine genetic resources collected by scientific research in international waters, a sticking point that almost derailed last-minute negotiations in March. It's a historic moment, Mina Epps, Ocean Team Director of the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, told reporters, but it's appalling that it took so long. The landmark treaty would establish a legal framework to extend swathes of environmental protections to international waters, which make up more than 60% of the world's oceans. Following 4 years of official negotiations, UN member states finally agreed on the text for the treaty in March after a flurry of final marathon talks. Since then, the text has been pored over by the UN's lawyers and translators to make sure it matches in the body's 6 official languages. But the journey won't be over on Monday. After the UN adopts the treaty, it will need to be ratified by at least 60 member states to go into effect. Humanity counts on the ocean, but can the ocean count on us? UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres asked on Twitter recently, calling for more maritime protections. Scientists have increasingly come to realize the importance of oceans, which produce most of the oxygen we breathe, limit climate change by absorbing carbon dioxide, and host rich areas of biodiversity, often at the microscopic level. But with so much of the world's oceans lying outside of individual countries, exclusive economic zones, and thus the jurisdiction of any single state, providing protection for the so-called high seas requires international cooperation. A key tool in the treaty will be the ability to create protected marine areas in international waters. Currently, any sort of conservation measures protects about 1% of the high seas. That is a drop in the bucket for what is required to achieve goals to set aside for the protection 30% of the world's oceans and lands by 2030 as agreed by world governments in a separate historic accord reached in Montreal in December. The treaty, officially known as the Treaty on Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction or BBNJ, also introduces requirements to carry out environmental impact studies for proposed activities to be carried out in international waters. While the treaty is a big step forward in establishing the governance of international waters, plenty of questions remain to be taken up by future BBNJ conference of the parties meetings. And that's all the international news we had for you this afternoon. We'll be back again tomorrow at 4 p.m. Thank you for watching and do have yourselves a fantastic afternoon.